Today, we're on a mission to find thrift store items priced under $5 and flip them for 4 times the price we paid. We'll transform our inexpensive finds in an attempt to quadruple their value. Will our mission be a success, or is this mission impossible? I'll let you decide. So let's get started.
Our first task is to locate thrift store items that actually cost less than $5 each, which is getting increasingly difficult at my Goodwill stores. For example, they're asking over $10 for a basket full of dusty flowers. And I thought for sure these football bookends would only be $3 or $4, but nope, they're over $5 too. I really like the arched glass in the door of this jewelry box. Cross your fingers, is it going to be under $5? Yes, only $3. That's for sure going in my cart. First, I needed to remove the glass and all of the interior pieces. I wasn't sure whether I was going to remove the mirror or not, but when it popped loose during the demo process, I just took it out too. The key to transforming this jewelry box is to remove the old flower design from the glass. Most of it scraped off with a razor blade. Then I just used some goof off to get the rest of it off. For an updated design, I added a rub-on transfer from the IOD traditional pots package across the bottom of the glass. Using a plastic scraper, these transfers adhere quickly and easily to glass. To give the cabinet a dark academia feel, I decided to paint the exterior with black chalk paint. When the paint was dry, I lightly distressed the edges with a sanding block and then brushed on a top coat of clear wax, wiping off the excess. To wallpaper the inside of the cabinet, I cut some pages from an old anatomy textbook. This would add to that dark academia vibe. I cut the pages to fit the back, sides, and bottom and adhered them with a good quality glue stick. However, I changed my mind about that anatomical picture on the back and covered it with a page cut from a book of poetry, much more to my liking. For an added little touch, I applied a rub-on transfer of a bee in the back top corner. Then I reattached the glass insert to the door. Since there were flowers in the design on the door, I decided to add some small florals inside the cabinet, and an old silver salt shaker from my stash was the perfect size for a vase. To make use of the salt shaker lid, I ran some florist wire through 2 of the shaker holes and then wrapped the wire around the top of the little vase. I couldn't leave the lid empty, so I hot glued a few greenery stems and some moss inside. Then I tied some ribbon around the top of the vase to conceal the wire. And finally, I hot glued a Dollar Tree transparent butterfly sticker to one of the leaves. This heavy glass piece caught my eye. It likely once held a clock, and even though the clock is missing, Goodwill is still asking almost $5. I'm afraid if I hadn't bought it, it might have ended up in the landfill. To begin the makeover, I pressed a piece of velvet into the clock opening and traced out the shape. Then I cut out the circle and hot glued it inside the opening. I thought the glass piece would be a great way to display a piece of jewelry, and I found an old flower pin in my stash. I broke off the pin on the back side so it would lie flat when I hot glued it to the velvet. Each flower had once held a bead that was now missing, so I hot glued fake pearls in those spots. Originally, I hadn't planned on doing anything to the glass, but then I thought some floral rub-on transfers would complement the flower pin. These purple flowers are from the Collage des Fleurs package. I was attracted to the heart-shaped handle on this cutting board, but I didn't care for the engraving that someone had added. I did leave the Bible verse in place, but I painted both sides of the board with white chalk paint. To create a design for the board, I cut out a piece of tissue paper and then I sprayed it with a light coat of pixie spray and adhered it to a piece of cardstock. Pixie spray is a temporary spray adhesive. I smoothed out the tissue paper, making sure there were no wrinkles or air bubbles. Then I selected an image of lavender and ran the tissue paper through my printer. I thought it would be easier to cut out the design while it was still attached to the cardstock, so I cut away most of the white areas and then carefully pulled the cardstock away from the tissue paper. I brushed Mod Podge over the cutting board and carefully arranged the tissue paper on the cutting board. I used my paintbrush to smooth out any wrinkles and to apply additional Mod Podge over the top of the tissue paper. Once the Mod Podge was dry, I distressed the edges of the cutting board with a sanding block. Then, rather than waxing the board, I applied another coat of Mod Podge over the entire board. That way it can easily be wiped clean without disturbing the design. For embellishment, I tied a small bundle of faux lavender to the handle with some gingham ribbon. This trifold mirror is definitely outdated, but it's a quality wood piece, and luckily for me, it was under $5. The first thing I did was remove the candle cups, which I thought largely contributed to its dated appearance. I wanted to give it a light cottage aesthetic, so I painted it with a light green chalk paint. Rather than remove the mirrors, I just left them in place and used a razor blade to clean them up after the paint had dried. Then I lightly distressed the edges with a sanding block and applied a coat of clear wax. I also applied some floral rub-on transfers to the side mirrors, but I wasn't happy with them, so you'll see that I removed them later. I wanted to make a wreath that perfectly fit inside the center mirror, so I twisted a faux vine into an oval shape and used florist tape to join the two ends of the vine together. For greenery, I cut off the individual stems from a thrift store garland and hot glued each stem to the vine. Then, to make sure the stems stayed attached, I hot glued little pieces of moss over the base of each stem all the way around the vine. To attach it to the mirror, I hot glued the vine to the inner sides. The wreath turned out exactly as I had hoped, but I was not happy with those side mirrors. So first I scraped off the floral transfers, and then I hammered the small shelves loose and pulled them off. To remove the staples, I hammered the staples back through to the back side until I had enough to grip onto so I could completely pull them out. I sanded over the spots where the shelves had been and painted those areas with the same green chalk paint. Once the paint was dry, I applied 2 new floral transfers where the shelves had been. and sealed them with some clear wax. I like this design so much better. I really don't understand Goodwill pricing. This large resin urn was almost $25, but this even larger metal vase was only $3. This might be my best find of the day. Last week, I had an issue of stain bleeding through chalk paint on a metal piece. So this week, I didn't risk it. I sprayed the vase with Zinsser primer, which is the only spray primer I use. When the primer was dry, I brushed on a coat of mineral-colored chalk paint. I let that dry, then I painted on the second coat in small sections at a time. I cut 2 pages of IOD paint inlays into strips and placed them on top of the wet paint. After each strip was placed in the paint, I spritzed it completely with water and pressed the paper into the paint. I continued this process all the way around the lower portion of the vase. I let the paint inlays completely dry. Then I came back and spritzed them again with water, waited a few seconds, and then I carefully peeled off the paper. I had used these inlays once before, so I was really pleased with how well they transferred. I waited until the design was dry, and then I brushed on a coat of white wax to seal the entire vase, wiping off any excess. I bought this small floral print because I thought I had a similar picture in my stash at home, and pictures sell well when sold in pairs. The simple floral print was lovely, so I just wanted to upgrade it a bit. I cut off the brown paper backing to reveal the staples holding the mat and print in place. I pried up the staples and removed everything. Then I carefully pried the inner mat away from the larger outer mat. I pulled out a sheet of William Morris wrapping paper and I cut a piece large enough to cover the outer mat. I sprayed the mat with adhesive and placed the gift wrap over it, smoothing out any wrinkles. I flipped it over and used a utility knife to cut off the extra paper along the edges and to cut out the center opening. At this point, the paper looks like wrapping paper, but if you lightly scuff it up with sandpaper to remove the sheen and slightly distress it, it suddenly looks like a vintage print. I reattached the floral print and the 2 mats using some masking tape. As it turned out, I did have a similar floral print in my stash, so I repeated this entire process, only this time using a different sheet of William Morris gift wrap to cover the outer mat. I considered painting the frames because the gold finish was a bit too bright. However, I decided to apply some black wax instead. Black wax adds dimension and subdues the shine of the gold paint. After returning the print and mats to the frame, I also returned the brown paper I had cut off on the back and covered the edges with paper packing tape. Can you believe this adorable little stool was only $1.84? I'm sure that's because no one has liked heart cutouts since the 1990s. But there are so many ways to disguise it. First, I painted the stool with a pretty shade of blue chalk paint. I didn't bother painting the top because I'm going to cover it. When the paint was dry, I lightly distressed the edges and brushed on a coat of clear wax. Some months ago, I thrifted this vintage doll blanket. At least, I think it's a doll blanket. It was falling apart and had holes in it, but I went ahead and washed it because it was really dirty. I cut off a piece that was large enough to cover the top of the stool. The old stuffing was so lumpy and matted that I went ahead and pulled it all out. Then, using my sewing machine, I stitched the two pieces of fabric together with the right sides facing out. I left one end open so that I could put some of the stuffing back inside. I could have used some new batting or polyfill, but I rather liked the lumpy look of the original stuffing. It just seemed appropriate for the age of the fabric. Once filled, I stitched up the fourth side and situated the little pillow on top of the stool. I decided to use some spray adhesive to hold it in place. And then to finish it off, I hot glued some lace ribbon along the edges, lining it up with my stitched lines. I think most people would pass by these small gold frames thinking they lacked potential, but I'm always wondering about how I can combine my thrift store finds. So I grabbed two old 8x10 picture frames from my stash. One was white and one was brown, so I painted them both with a couple coats of white chalk paint to match. When the paint was dry, I applied a top coat of clear wax. Now for the artwork that goes inside the frame. First, I applied spray adhesive to the glass and adhered a piece of scrapbook paper. I used a utility knife to cut off the extra paper. I drew diagonal lines across the paper to find and mark the center. Then I lined up one of the small gold frames over that center mark and hot glued it in place. I placed a bird print in the frame and reinserted the piece of glass. I repeated this entire process with the second frame using a contrasting piece of scrapbook paper. The 8x10 frames came with easels on the back, so to reassemble them, I popped the easels off. Then, to clean up the back side, I painted the frame and covered the backing with another piece of scrapbook paper. Finally, I attached a sawtooth hanger. I'm curious, which thrift store find do you think saw the greatest increase in value as a result of today's upcycling projects? As a reseller, it's definitely something to consider when you're thrift shopping. Thanks so much for watching today. And if you'd like to see more thrift flips, here's another video I think you'll like.